Imagine trying to suffocate a man only to realize he's the one who controls the oxygen in the room. That is the exact nightmare Washington just woke up to. If you thought the trade battle between the United States and Canada couldn't get any more intense, what just happened behind closed doors is going to completely shatter how you see this entire conflict. The mainstream media is feeding you a narrative about a standard political trade spat. They are entirely missing the structural earthquake that just fractured the North American economy. Donald Trump believed he had just delivered a crushing, unrecoverable blow to Canada. He dropped a massive, unprecedented 35% tariff ultimatum on Ottawa's desk. It was a move designed with one brutal purpose: to force Canada into a corner, make them bend the knee, and accept Washington's demands without a fight. They expected panic. They expected a white flag. They expected capitulation. Instead, Washington got a masterclass in economic warfare. Within days, Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, executed a response so calculated, so ruthlessly precise, that analysts from Wall Street to London are now saying the White House never even saw it coming. And here is the twist that has the political establishment in absolute freefall. Carney didn't just retaliate. He took Trump's own words, Trump's own strategy, and Trump's own logic and turned them into a lethal weapon against American dominance on the global stage. Suddenly, what was supposed to be the ultimate show of American economic supremacy has mutated into one of the most catastrophic policy backfires of the modern era. Markets are violently recalibrating. World leaders are suddenly paying very close attention. And inside the White House, officials are desperately scrambling to control a narrative that has completely slipped through their fingers. Because the brutal reality of international power is this: when you issue a public ultimatum to your closest, most integrated trading partner, you expect them to blink first. But what happens when they don't? What happens when they respond not with fear, but with a strategy that flips the entire game board and traps you in your own aggressively laid snare? That is exactly the situation unfolding right now. The implications are actively reshaping global trade, and you are going to be the one paying the price for Washington's hubris. To understand why this confrontation has suddenly exploded into the most important geopolitical story of the year, you have to look at the absolute arrogance that led Washington to make such a blind, bold move in the first place. This 35% tariff announcement did not drop out of a clear blue sky. For months, tensions had been quietly boiling behind the scenes. Trump had repeatedly, loudly argued that Canada was actively taking advantage of the United States. He claimed the trade agreements were outdated, one-sided, and actively robbing American workers. At rallies, on social media, and in press briefings, he framed the issue in the simplest, most dangerous terms possible. America has the larger economy. America has the bigger consumer market. Therefore, Canada depends on the United States far more than the United States will ever depend on Canada. That single fatal assumption became the entire foundation of the strategy. Inside the Oval Office, advisors calculated that raising tariffs to a jaw-dropping 35% would force Ottawa into an impossible, suffocating corner. The math to them was simple. Roughly 3/4 of all Canadian exports traditionally flow south directly into the American market. We are talking about billions upon billions of dollars, energy products powering the Midwest, timber building American homes, metals, automobiles, agricultural goods. So when the tariff package was announced, the message from Washington was an unapologetic threat. This was the moment Canada was supposed to break. Trump stood in front of the cameras and framed the decision as a long overdue correction. He promised that these tariffs would bring jobs back, strengthen American industry, and prove to the globe that the United States was the undisputed heavyweight champion of trade. His supporters applauded it as a bold challenge to the status quo. But they made one critical, devastating miscalculation. They believed Canada had no room to maneuver. They assumed that because Canada was tied to the American market, they would be forced to swallow whatever terms Washington dictated. They viewed tariffs purely as a weapon of leverage. They entirely underestimated the man sitting across the table. When Mark Carney stepped into power, he brought with him a psychological profile that Washington was completely unprepared to handle. Carney is not a traditional loud-mouthed politician. He is not an improviser who makes policy based on the morning news cycle. He is a career economist, a financial architect who has spent his life navigating the most terrifying global financial crises in modern history. As the former governor of the Bank of Canada and later the governor of the Bank of England, he has sat in emergency locked-door meetings with central bankers while entire global markets teetered on the absolute brink of collapse. Pressure, uncertainty, and economic brinkmanship are not abstract concepts to Mark Carney. They are his native language. So, when Trump dropped the 35% tariff bomb, Carney did not react the way Washington expected. He didn't rush to a podium to deliver an emotional, angry speech. He didn't fire off dramatic threats. He didn't match Trump's aggression with panic. In fact, in the immediate hours following the announcement, Canadian officials barely reacted publicly at all. To the untrained eye, to the arrogant observers in D.C., it looked like Canada was caught totally off guard. It looked like they were stunned into submission. But silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes silence is just the sound of a trap being set. Behind closed doors, Ottawa was already executing contingency plans that had been quietly developed months in advance. Carney's economic advisors had already mapped North American supply chains down to the microscopic level. They knew exactly where Canadian resources were most deeply, irreversibly embedded in the American industrial machine, and their research revealed the exact truth that Washington had ignored. The relationship wasn't a one-way street of dependency. It was a deeply integrated nervous system. American companies relied desperately on Canadian energy, raw materials, and precision industrial components. From the oil pipelines feeding crucial U.S. refineries, to the very lumber used to build American housing tracts, to the auto parts that cross the border 6 times before a car is finished, the economies were fused. If you sever an artery to hurt your opponent, you are going to bleed out too. Carney understood this. He treated Trump's ultimatum exactly like a chess match. And in chess, the grandmaster never responds to an aggressive opening with panic. They step back, analyze the board, and strike exactly where the opponent's king is entirely exposed. Within 48 hours, Carney finally stepped in front of the cameras. And when he spoke, the tone sent a chill through the international markets. There was no anger. There were no theatrical accusations. He was absolutely ice cold. He calmly explained that Canada respected the United States as a neighbor, but he made one unshakable declaration. Canada would not accept economic pressure designed to force political submission. Then he opened his playbook. And I want to give you the exact receipts of how Carney dismantled Washington's strategy piece by piece. Receipt 1, the surgical counterstrike. Carney announced that Ottawa was implementing targeted countermeasures against American exports. But this wasn't a blind, sweeping retaliation. This was a sniper shot. The Canadian government carefully selected specific American industries located in highly influential, politically sensitive states. They erected precise trade barriers that instantly turned the political pressure back onto Washington. Suddenly, the tariff war that Trump believed would crush Canada was sending immediate, agonizing shockwaves through his own domestic political base. American farmers, manufacturers, and local politicians were suddenly the ones screaming for relief. But the targeted tariffs were just the opening jab. What Carney was building behind the scenes was the knockout blow. Receipt 2, the global bypass. While Washington was totally obsessed with the daily news cycle of the trade fight, Carney was playing a massive long-term strategic game. The counter tariffs were just designed to buy time. Within days of Trump's ultimatum, Canadian trade officials threw negotiations with major European and Asian economies into absolute overdrive. For decades, the assumption was that Canada was handcuffed to the U.S. market. The 75% export dependency was treated like an unbreakable law of gravity. But Carney's team had been studying exactly how to reverse gravity. Trade delegations from Ottawa began appearing in Tokyo, in Brussels, in Seoul. Meetings that were supposed to be exploratory were suddenly finalized. Agreements that usually take years of bureaucratic red tape were pushed through in weeks. Energy contracts were suddenly signed with European partners desperate for reliable suppliers outside of Russian influence. Technology and heavy manufacturing deals were locked in with Asian economies hungry to diversify their supply chains away from an unpredictable North America. Do you see the psychological warfare here? At the exact moment Washington was trying to make Canada look weak, isolated, and desperate, Carney made Canada look like the most dynamic, highly sought-after trading partner on the planet. Financial markets picked up on this instantly. Analysts realized that if Canada successfully redirected even a fraction of its exports to these new markets, the leverage of Trump's 35% tariff would evaporate into thin air. American companies were suddenly facing catastrophic supply chain disruptions, while Canadian producers were quietly securing richer, more stable customers thousands of miles away. The economic leverage Washington assumed was absolute was entirely melting away. Inside the United States, the bleeding started almost immediately. This is where Washington's hubris hits your wallet. American manufacturers began flashing warning signs that the tariffs were triggering supply chain deaths across key sectors. Construction companies went into full panic mode as the price of Canadian lumber spiked, adding thousands of dollars to the cost of a new American home. Energy executives warned that choking off Canadian imports was going to severely spike fuel prices ahead of the winter. Automakers quietly reminded the White House that you cannot build an American car without Canadian parts, meaning Trump's tariffs were essentially a massive new tax placed directly on the American consumer. The weapon designed to project American strength was actively mutilating American industry. But the moment that truly shattered the narrative, the moment that proved Washington was entirely outmatched on the intellectual level, happened on the global stage. Days after the tariffs took effect, Mark Carney took the podium at a major international economic summit. The room was packed with global government officials, corporate titans, and financial analysts. Everyone expected a fiery defensive rant against the United States. Instead, Carney spoke in the calm, analytical tone of a man who already knew he had won the game. He didn't even mention Donald Trump by name. He didn't have to. He addressed the core American claim that had been circulating for weeks, the arrogant suggestion that Canada's prosperity existed solely because of the United States. Carney looked out at the room and delivered a line that was devastatingly precise. He said, "Canada does not exist because of any other country's generosity. Canada thrives because its people built a resilient economy, strong institutions, and partnerships across the world." The room went dead silent and then erupted. That clip spread across global financial networks like wildfire. It wasn't just a political soundbite, it was a total reframing of reality. It was a quiet, crushing rebuttal to Washington's entire philosophy of dominance. And suddenly, the global conversation shifted. No one was asking if Canada could survive the tariffs anymore. The world was asking if the United States had completely underestimated Mark Carney. Because the longer analysts studied the board, the clearer it became. Carney's response was not reactive. It was an offensive strategy disguised as defense. He was using Trump's own pressure campaign as the perfect excuse to radically accelerate Canada's global independence. And this is where the panic truly set in at the White House. The administration had framed this entire standoff as a flex of American muscle. They expected Ottawa to crawl back, beg for relief, and sign whatever paper was put in front of them. Instead, Mark Carney was actively traveling the globe, meeting with leaders across multiple continents, and permanently shifting trade routes away from American ports. In Tokyo, he locked down tech and energy cooperation. In Brussels, European leaders openly praised the stability of Canada in direct, humiliating contrast to the unpredictability of Washington. In Australia and India, massive long-term infrastructure and resource deals were being mapped out. For 70 years, the U.S.-Canada border was the most stable, integrated economic engine on Earth. Disrupting it was considered unthinkable, but Trump broke the seal, and Carney used that exact moment to permanently change the equation. Instead of treating the U.S. as the center of the economic universe, Carney positioned Canada as the flexible, reliable pivot point for the rest of the world. And then came receipt 3, the syndicate, the most dangerous move of all. Just when Washington thought the situation was settling into a tense stalemate, Carney shifted the entire playing field from a bilateral dispute into a global movement. He didn't just want to protect Canada, he wanted to permanently neutralize Washington's ability to use tariffs as a weapon ever again. Carney began quietly organizing what analysts are now calling a coalition of middle powers. The logic was brilliant and terrifying for the American empire. If a massive superpower like the United States can use its sheer market size to bully one country, it can bully any country. But if mid-sized economies stop fighting alone and start coordinating their trade policies, they can collectively counteract the economic gravity of the United States. During another global forum, Carney began outlining this new doctrine. He described a world where supply chains could no longer rely on a single, dominant, unpredictable market. He urged nations to build resilient networks that could instantly route around economic shocks, specifically shocks coming from Washington. He wasn't just giving a speech, he was issuing a call to action, and the world was listening. Officials from dozens of countries quietly began exploring ways to expand trade with Canada and, crucially, with each other. They started discussing coordinated responses to disruptive American tariffs. They were building an economic shield. And then Carney delivered the final fatal psychological blow. Speaking to an audience of international leaders, he discussed the absolute necessity of predictable trade and cooperative institutions. And then he paused, looked at the crowd, and said the words that are now echoing through the halls of every major financial institution on Earth. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That phrase was an absolute masterstroke. It was an unmistakable warning to the rest of the world. If you do not coordinate, if you do not build alternative alliances, Washington will eventually come for your economy next. But if you work together, you can strip the superpower of its ultimate weapon. The White House was paralyzed. The original purpose of Trump's tariff was to demonstrate American power. Instead, he had accidentally triggered the formation of a global economic network explicitly designed to bypass the United States entirely. Let's look at the absolute devastation unfolding right now because of this miscalculation. Let's look at the reality of what this means for you. American industries are bleeding. Manufacturers are issuing severe warnings about skyrocketing input costs. Exporters are terrified of permanently losing access to Canadian markets that they spent decades cultivating. Domestic American investors are freezing capital because they have no idea if the supply chains they rely on will exist next month. The economic pressure Trump tried to put on Ottawa has boomeranged with lethal force directly into the American heartland. And what is Carney doing? He's not gloating. He's not tweeting insults. He is methodically, quietly expanding Canada's global footprint. He turned a defensive crisis into the greatest platform for Canadian economic expansion in a century. We are now looking at two entirely divergent scenarios, and both of them spell disaster for Washington's traditional dominance. Let's look at scenario A, the escalation. Washington refuses to admit defeat. Trump doubles down. He raises tariffs even higher, trying to force the issue through sheer brute trauma. What happens? Inflation inside the United States goes supercritical. The American housing market grinds to an absolute halt because lumber and raw materials are unaffordable. Auto plants in the Rust Belt begin mass layoffs because the cross-border supply chain is entirely paralyzed. Energy grids in the northern states face catastrophic price spikes. The U.S. government ends up financially punishing its own citizens, destroying its own middle class, just to save face on the political stage. Meanwhile, Canada simply accelerates its pivot to Europe and Asia, permanently locking America out of its most vital resources. Now let's look at scenario B, the capitulation. Washington realizes the trap has closed. The internal corporate pressure becomes too massive. The White House quietly backs down, offers exemptions, and tries to return to the status quo. But the damage is already permanent. The illusion of absolute American economic hegemony is shattered. Every nation on earth has just watched Canada call Washington's bluff and win. The fear that kept the global system completely subservient to American demands is gone. Mark Carney proved that the emperor has no clothes, and even if the tariffs vanish tomorrow, the new trade routes to Tokyo, Brussels, and Seoul are already built. The contracts are signed. The leverage is gone forever. This is the ultimate cost of the arrogance of empire. For generations, Washington operated on the deeply flawed belief that size and volume alone were substitutes for strategy. They believed that because they were the biggest market, they didn't have to be the smartest player in the room. They treated their closest ally not as a partner, but as a subordinate that could be bullied for cheap domestic political points. But they brought a sledgehammer to a game of chess. They tried to intimidate an architect who was already 3 steps ahead, already laying the foundation for a world that simply doesn't need to rely on American permission anymore. The confrontation that began with a single arrogant tariff announcement has permanently mutated. It is no longer just a trade dispute. It is a historic recalibration of global power. It is the exact moment the world realized that you can build a resilient, thriving economy without bowing to the economic gravity of the United States. You are watching history shift in real time. The expensive lesson that Washington walked blindly into is currently unfolding, and you, the American consumer, the worker, the everyday citizen, are the one paying the tuition. If you want to actually understand the real moves being made on the global geopolitical chessboard, the strategic masterstrokes that the mainstream media completely ignores until it is far too late, you need to hit subscribe right now. I want to know exactly what you think in the comments down below. Did Washington completely overplay its hand through sheer arrogance, or is Mark Carney playing a dangerous game that could still backfire? The board is set. The trap is sprung. Let's get into it down below.